Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 19th day of August in the year 2015, and by tomorrow we will be 2 months, 2/3 of the way through the month of August. It is absolutely amazing the way the time moves, and of course we're seeing summer rapidly fade, as it were. I can share with you a little bit of a personal thing. Tomorrow we don't have a program here at the Virtual Center. My wife and I are scheduled to drive over to the Greenbrier, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from where we're broadcasting here, where the New Orleans Saints are conducting their practice, the NFL team at the facility that was created over there just for them. And for the next 2 days, today and tomorrow, the New England Patriots are visiting, and they're going to have a joint training session with the New Orleans Saints. And we have a reservation to go to the session tomorrow. I believe it's supposed to start at 9:30 in the morning. We're planning to get there about 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and I've got to get my voice warmed up for screaming in support of the Patriots and all that. But seriously, I'm kind of looking forward to it. I really don't know what to expect. But to be honest with you, just spending 4 or 5 hours doing something different and enjoying it with my wife is something I'm looking forward to. It's the day I'm looking forward to, whatever happens. So if something really unique happens, I'll be sure to share it with you when we get back on here at the Virtual Center next week. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I usually say that every day, but on the other hand, I think it's important to say that every day because it's so true. I just marvel at the opportunity that this provides for me personally, and to get into the kind of depth that we've been into, especially with Federalist Number 10. I was sharing with Bob Kincaid before we came on the air today that we'll have done 3 full weeks of live broadcasting on Federalist Number 10. And that's 5.5 hours a week. So that's 16.5 hours of live broadcasting on that one document. I'm presuming that we'll complete the document today. And then I'm thinking that the first, at least at the beginning of next week, we can begin to go back and formulate and put things together and try to figure out where we are and what we've got, and try to relate it. We may get into some of that today, because I think the most obvious question is, once you are able to get your arms around the program or the strategy or the formula that James Madison had for making republicanism work, then it seems to me we have to look at the things that are going on in Washington today and try to pinpoint exactly what the major differences are between what we're doing now and what Madison proposed we needed to do in order for republicanism to continue to function and indeed to flourish. So I think there's still some oversight and some discussion and general speculation ahead of us here, but first we need to work our way through the remainder of the Federalist 10 document. I'm sure that some of you who have been with us on a regular basis out there have questions or concerns or comments or issues that may be nagging at you. And we have a phone number that we have reserved in order so that you can get on the air and you can share these feelings, these things, with not only with me but with our other listeners. And I encourage you to do that, because I encourage you to recognize that if these things bother you, they also bother other folks as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to share your thinking or your ideas with me personally, one-on-one via email, I welcome and look forward to hearing from you. My email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN, 906 at gmail.com. And that's all one word, O'Brien 906, W.A. O'Brien 906. And then I remind you again of our Facebook page. And I have taken to Facebook for each of our programs this week and just I put a very short posting on Facebook earlier today, just saying that it looked like we would be finishing up with Federalist number 10 today, and then we would be spending whatever time we would have left trying to reach some conclusions and begin to look at some of the things that are happening in Washington and try to pinpoint exactly how they differ, how they veer away from the kinds of things that James Madison was telling us a republic required in order to remain functioning, and indeed in order to flourish. I think, again, we have to realize that the issue that really prompts the entire document, of course, is Madison's treatment of history, which indicates that popular governments have always failed because of their tendency toward the violence of faction. And again, I just offer this as an observation. I've said it more than once in the last couple of programs. I always took that probably not as literally as I'm taking it now. I tended to conclude from Madison's concern about the violence of factions that what he was really saying was the nature of man as being driven by the self-interest that causes him to join factions. My inclination has always been to take Madison's concern about factions and read more into it than now I'm becoming more and more convinced I should not do. I've really kind of concluded that I really need to take Madison at his word. The issue is faction. It's not self-interest per se, because Madison recognizes that self-interest is always there. It's when self-interest drives a person to organize with others who have the same self-interest and organize a politically active, a politically motivated group, movement, faction. That's when the danger comes, because the mere existence of faction suggests that self-interest has already won the day. In other words, the contest or the struggles within each of us between our conscience and our recognition of self-interest. In other words, the difference between what we reason with our brain and what we want, what we wish for with our heart. Madison accepts the fact, the writings of Hume and the others, to suggest that when the individual is alone and by himself, the public interest, the so-called moral sense within all of us, has at least an equal chance, and maybe even a better chance, of winning out over our inclination to go with self-interest. In other words, we may recognize, Madison would say, we may recognize that my personal best interest would be benefited if I did this. But on the other hand, I know that that's not right. I know that's not the way I should go. I know that's not in the best interest of other people. So therefore, even though I know what side my bread is buttered on, so to speak, under the circumstances, I'm going to go with what I know to be right. Madison believes that that is possible as long as one is alone. as long as one is making decisions independently. But when the pressure of the group is thrown into the equation, these considerations of moral sense, morality, of the public good, and all the rest of it don't have a chance, Madison seems to be saying. And so when one basically makes the decision to begin working with a group with the same interests as you have, then Madison would tell us that self-interest has already won the day. You have already made the decision to go with your self-interest rather than with your conscience or with what you know to be the public interest. And I think that's the key. So again, my inclination is to begin to take Madison's concern about factions much more seriously and much more literally than I've ever done in the past. Yesterday, for those of you who were with us, and I don't want to get into an extended review of yesterday's program because it would eat up a significant portion of our time together today, and I don't want to do that. I do invite you to go to the whiterosesociety.org or go to YouTube because I trust that Horst is continuing to post these programs on YouTube, and look for the archive of yesterday's program, which is the program for August 18th, for Tuesday, August 18th. And in that program, we spent the bulk of our time looking at the issues of refining and enlarging the public views, which is Madison's suggested need or Madison's dictum, if you will, for solving the problems of the violence of factions. You recall that when in looking at Federalist number 10, Madison had said that there are two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic. The first difference is the delegation of the government in a republic to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. The second point of difference is the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which a republic may be extended. We're going to be going into that second category, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country. That's the last major element of the document. That's what we'll be going into today. We spent the bulk of yesterday's program looking at the first point of difference between a democracy and a republic, which is the process of refining and enlarging the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. And if you remember, we spent quite a bit of time based on the question, where do these chosen body of citizens come from? Where do we find people whose wisdom and sense of justice and patriotism is going to take precedence over the self-interest? In other words, if the existence of factions overwhelms man's sense of morality or sense of concern for others, then where are we going to find these chosen citizens who can continually operate with the best interests of the community in mind all the time? Where are we going to find these people that are not going to be swayed by self-interest, but are going to be able to keep the public interest in focus all the time? And of course, what we learned yesterday was that Madison's answer to that question is, these people don't currently exist. We have to create them. We have to manufacture them. We have to set up our Republican system in such a way that we successfully bleed out self-interest from our representatives. And the way you do that, Madison says, is to refine the public interest by passing it through chosen body of citizens. And Madison's thinking is that this continuous process of refining self-interest gradually eliminates or weakens self-interest as we go up the ladder from the most local level where our elections are held to the upper levels, which would be our elections for representatives in Congress and the selection of members of the United States Senate. Madison's argument is, if you look at, or his thinking is, if you look at the different levels of elections and competition, each iteration of that electoral process is going to enhance the influence of public interest and reduce the interest of self-interest in the process. In other words, you are refining the public interest by gradually eliminating self-interest from the process. You are engaged, Madison in another place uses this term. I think he uses this term in one of his speeches at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 to make his point. He talks about periodic distillations of self-interest. In other words, by going through these filtration processes, you are gradually eliminating or weakening self-interest from the process, so that by the time you get to the upper levels of decision-making, by the time power has shifted from the most local level to the larger level, to a larger level, to the statewide level, to the national level, then Madison's thinking is that more often than not, you're going to be ending up at the top with a group of elected representatives whose major concern is the public interest, whose self-interest is going to be eliminated in the process. And so what you need in order for that to happen, you need to educate your citizens, your electorate, as well as your representatives. And what you have to do, Madison says, is enlarge the public views. So you are refining and enlarging the public views by passing them through these filtration processes, these filtration systems, if you will. And we spent quite a bit of time yesterday talking about the phrase enlarge the public views and what that means. And what we're talking about here is education. We are talking about education, sensitizing people to the needs and concerns of other people beside yourself. In other words, taking off the blinders that govern people's decision-making when self-interest totally drives what they are doing. The more we can make people aware of the larger perspective, the broader perspective or worldview, the better off we are. By definition, that's going to cause citizens to look for representatives who seem to be aware of and focusing on the public interest rather than the private interests. And so the entire process is that it begins with citizens recognizing and looking for a certain kind of representative or a certain kind of candidate. And that's the candidate who's not totally driven by a narrow, self-interested agenda, but is the candidate who seems to have the broadest perspective possible, who seems able and willing to be sensitive to the needs and concerns of other people. And if that happens at the beginning, at the bottom level, then as you go up, that process of filtering out self-interest by emphasizing the public interest at each level is going to result in the fact that when you get to the upper levels of government decision-making, you're dealing with people whose priority is most likely to be the public interest. In Madison's language, that's the point at which you have found the chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary and partial considerations. You're dealing with people who, once they are aware of the importance and the necessity of focusing on the public interest, will be able to repress self-interest. It's always there. You're not going to eliminate it, but you're going to get people to be able to resist letting it drive what you do, letting it drive your decision-making and your behavior as a citizen or as an elected representative. I just thought of this now. This may not be helpful because it's such a different situation. But I was talking to somebody earlier today whose husband, a friend whose husband, is 3 weeks into trying to quit cigarettes, quit smoking. And she pointed out that this is probably the 6th or 7th time that he's tried over the last 20 or 25 years. And she tries to be as encouraging as possible because she recognizes how difficult it is. And I related to her situation and to his, because I was a smoker and I quit smoking a number of years ago. In fact, I can tell you exactly, it was Christmas time in the year 1980. So it's been 35 years since I've had a cigarette. I still want them. I don't think you ever lose the psychological sense of relaxation and pleasure that comes from a cigarette. I have even found myself saying in certain situations, "Oh, I'm so stressed, I need to relax. I wish I still smoked." Because in my mind, there's a connection between relaxation and smoking cigarettes. So what then has 35 years of not smoking, what has it accomplished? It hasn't eliminated my desire to smoke, but it has strengthened my ability to resist the temptation to smoke. When I think about it, and I recognize that one cigarette would put me right back to where I was, that's enough for me to resist the temptation. And I think that's what the same kind of thing that Madison's talking about with this filtration or refining the public interest. So again, you're doing two things. You're refining the public interest and you're broadening the perspective, not only of those who are running for election as representatives, but you're broadening the perspective as well of citizens who are voting for them. In other words, you are sensitizing citizens, voters, to the need to elect people who are able to overcome the lure of self-interest to the point that self-interest drives everything that they do. That's really what it seems to me you're looking for. And this is what we spent most of our program on yesterday. Again, and I think it's important to mention this because it is an important issue. Even though we spent quite a bit of time on it yesterday, I think it's important at least making further reference to it today. It is so easy to jump to the conclusion that when Madison talks about a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice the best interests of their country to self-interest, to temporary or partial considerations. It's so easy to interpret that in saying what Madison's talking about there are the wealthy, the upper class, the few. What he's basically talking about is setting up a system which is designed to allow the wealthiest people to make the decisions, to be elected as representatives. There's no question that that is an outcome. There's no question, and we'll understand as we go further into this today, we'll understand why that's true. It is clear that the result of this is that those people being elected, those people with the more cosmopolitan, broader worldview, tend to be your best educated, those from wealthy families who have traveled extensively and who have been able to experience this broader worldview. By definition, they're the ones who fit that bill. But there's a difference between saying that's an outcome and saying that's the whole intent of the process, is to come up with an intricate way to encourage people to turn power over to the few. I think there's an inclination, a tendency to do that. And the next sentence in Federalist number 10 is the one that, it seems to me, draws a lot of attention and causes a lot of anxiety, a lot of angst among people who read it. Because Madison says, under such a regulation, under a system which does this, refines the public views, enlarges the public views, by passing them through a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom, love of justice, and patriotism, etc. Madison says, under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose. Think about that. Madison is saying that these people who have gone through this filtration process, this refinement process, will be better qualified to define the interest of the public than the public itself, if you've had a way to get all the people that make up the public together and ask them for their view. This is really significant. Because what Madison is saying here, what he's implying or assuming, is that the public view, the public interest, what's best for everybody, may not be what everybody wants. The public interest may not be what the majority wants. It clearly is not what the minority wants. It probably isn't what the majority wants. So let's assume that you could get the entire society together, the entire public, and give them an opportunity, every person, to express his druthers, his will. Then you would, it seems to me, then you would have an accurate reflection of the public interest because it's the public that gave it to you. Madison is unwilling to accept this because he says it may well happen that the public interest defined by the representatives of the people is more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves. Madison is suggesting that these people know what's best for the public, for society as a whole, better than if you poll the people themselves. Why would he say that? It seems to me he would be saying that because the vast majority of the public have not gone through the process of refinement and the enlargement of the public views. In other words, they have not been exposed to the filtration, refinement, distillation process, which has made them overly or extremely sensitive to the public interest and thereby made them able to repress self-interest. So again, Madison is accepting the reality that the public interest, which is a philosophical, abstract concept, may be consistent with what the public would want if it had the opportunity to express its will, but it may not. And I think that's extremely significant because much of the criticism of Rousseau's idea of the general will was focused on the issue, how do you know what it is? How do you know what the general will is? Because you can't get, Rousseau acknowledges, you can't get the entire public together. So the question is, how do you know what this general will is? And traditionally throughout history, we have come up with a number societies, different political systems have come up with a number of strategies, a number of gimmicks in order to identify those best able to define the general will. Some, for example, ancient Sparta in Greece, which was a very militaristic society. In Sparta, the public interest was best defined by military leaders, by spokesmen for the military. In some societies, the public interest is best defined by the best educated, by those who were educated throughout their lives for the process of leadership. Here we get into Plato's idea of the so-called philosopher king, those people that are educated from the very beginning to assume positions of leadership and position. Then we have those societies where power to define the public interest is awarded to those who have the most physical strength, or have the most talent, or are able to demonstrate that they are the most meritorious, or are the wealthiest. The assumptions that drive a free enterprise system, if indeed it was really free enterprise, the assumptions which drive it are that if all things being equal, there's really equal opportunity out there. And if we can assume that in fair and equal competition, the most talent and the most ability will rise to the top, the cream will rise to the top, which is what Jefferson envisioned in his system, then the assumption is if you skim the cream of ability off the top, you have thereby found the people best able to define the general will or the public interest. There are other societies where age, experience, the number of years lived, has been a major consideration in the definition of the public interest. We've seen many Native American societies, for example, if you remember the old Roy Rogers and Gene Autry and Lone Ranger films and all that. The chief, the tribe, the Indian tribe's chief always was an older guy. And when the elderly would sit around the campfire and make decisions for the entire group, the assumption was that the younger folks within the tribe, within the community, would be best to go along with the wisdom and the experience and the number of years lived by the elderly. That they had been able over a long lifetime to acquire the kind of wisdom and knowledge that made them best able to define the interest for the entire group. So the fact of the matter is, if you look through history, you can find all sorts of examples of different strategies, different definitions of those best able to define the public interest. One of the keys, it seems to me, everybody's always looking for the keys or the tips or the strategies that make history easier to understand and appreciate. It seems to me one of the most valuable tips that you can give students is to encourage them as they read about different societies, different eras, different periods of history, whether it's in their own country or whether it's in other countries. Look for not only who the leaders are, but the basis on which they are granted the power to lead. In other words, the key question is not so much how do they get the power to lead, it's why do people continue to give them that power, to support their right to have that power. And of course, we know that in many societies throughout our history, religion has been a major factor in determining who would best be qualified to define the public interest. Those who are able to convince the vast majority of people in that particular society that God has somehow chosen them for their positions of leadership. God has indicated that these people are God's chosen people, God's chosen representatives, and that people's only option is to obey the leadership because the leadership gets its authority to rule directly from God. And to question the power of these people is literally to question God himself. And that in Western history is often referred to as the so-called divine right of kings. The kings of medieval and Europe used to claim that their right to rule politically was based on the wisdom and the power and the insight that came directly to them from God. And of course, that's exactly the same argument that John Winthrop uses in his speech to the Massachusetts General Court in 1635, when he is challenged. The magistrates are challenged for some of the decisions. And John Winthrop, the governor, appears before the General Assembly, the General Court, the legislature comprised of elected representatives, and he makes the point that in our Constitution, in our way of governing, which comes directly from God, I get my right to rule from you. You elect me. But once you elect me, I'm not accountable to you. I'm accountable to God. And so in a sense, what Winthrop is telling the people who elected him, that he's not accountable to them. He's accountable to God. And thus we have, various spin-offs of this idea. Again, what's the whole point of this? The point that I'm trying to make is it's so easy to read into Madison the idea that in his description of the most considerate and virtuous citizens, the chosen body of citizens whose wisdom and love of justice and patriotism will give them insight into the public interest that others don't have. It's so easy to interpret this as an effort to grant power to the few because of the wealth and influence they have. What I have tended to ignore, and what I think most people who read this tend to ignore as well, is the educational process that Madison lays out in Federalist Number 10 in order to equip these people for this particular role. And Madison goes so far as to say that the success of Republican government itself is driven by the extent to which those who can keep their eye on the ball, those who can keep their eye focused on the public interest to the exclusion of private interest, those are the ones that need to be calling the shots and making the decision. And again, Madison even says, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by these people, by these representatives, is more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves. It seems to me that's what he's saying here. That's what he means. And it's going to turn out, obviously, that a lot of these people are the well-heeled, are the best educated, and the wealthiest and most influential people in the community. That's going to happen, but there's a difference between that and a scheme to grant them power by claiming that they have insights that other people don't have. Madison's not trusting to that, and Madison is not, it seems to me, willing to accept the fact that just because people come from a particular family or from a background of wealth, that enables them to accurately describe or to define the public interest and to overcome their inclination towards self-interest. Madison's not willing to accept this. Madison said we have an obligation to create these people by refining and enlarging the public views and making sure that when they get into these positions of authority, to make decisions, that they are well equipped to do a good job. That's kind of where we spent the bulk of our time yesterday. And it seems to me that then you get into the issue, and Madison raises this issue, how many representatives, what's a good number? How many representatives should we have? How many people, how many constituents should the representative represent? When do you get to a point where there are so few representatives that there is no way that they could know their own constituency, that they could know what the public interest is? So Madison said you got to avoid that. You got to make sure that you have enough representatives in order to make it more likely that the representative will be familiar with and know the constituents that they are representing. But on the other hand, Madison thinks or says, you can't afford to have so many representatives that the process becomes chaotic. There's an optimum number or an optimum proportion here. There's an ideal balanced number, if you will. How does he say this? Madison says, and he basically frames this by saying, we get into the discussion of the differences between small or extensive republics. And if you remember, most people believed that Republican government had to be small, Montesquieu, so that the representative could know the constituency and the constituents could know the representative. Now Madison is proposing larger areas of governance for the republic. He's talking about a republic extended over a wide area. And so the question then, how do you get, once you have a wide area that is governed by republicanism, how do you avoid the situation where the area is so large and there are so many constituents in it and so many different interests in it that the representative can't possibly stay in touch or accurately speak for those that he represents? Madison says the following, and in this context, and I think this is the way he expresses it. He says, in the first place, it is to be remarked that however small the republic may be, the representatives must be raised to a certain number in order to guard against the cabals of a few. If you have too few representatives, then power tends to go to the strongest people, to the strongest personalities, and cliques form within government itself, where certain representatives gravitate towards certain leadership types. We see that in government all the time. we see that there are certain people within our parties, our political parties, that seem to be able to garner more respect. There are a number of representatives who will openly admit that they take their signal, they take their marching orders, if you will, from certain people whose leadership skills they respect. So we know this. So Madison said, in order to guard against the cabals of a few, the number of representatives needs to be raised to a certain number. You've got to have enough representatives to make cliques a little bit more difficult. However large it may be, they must be limited to a certain number in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. So you can have too few, or you can have too many. For the last number of years, the last 8 years, I've been chairing a hospital board here in southern West Virginia. And we have 20 members on our board. And many times people made the comment that a board made up of 20 people becomes dysfunctional. It becomes so chaotic that it couldn't do anything. And one of the things that has really made me extremely proud of this group is that we've got the kind of board that gets things done in spite of its size. And we have the ideal situation because the board is big enough to represent major constituencies within our community. This hospital is fortunate to have a really top-notch board because the board is comprised of representatives from constituencies all over the community that the hospital serves. And yet, even though it's large, it remains functional. That's not easy to do. It's not that common. Madison is right here. Hence, Madison says, the number of representatives in the two cases not being in proportion to that of the two constituents and being proportionally greater in the small republic, it follows that if the proportion of fit characters be not less in the large than in the small republic, the former will represent a greater option and consequently a greater probability of a fit choice. Madison is basically saying that chances are the best people to be representatives, the best people to keep their eye on the public interest, tends to come from larger republics rather than small ones. The reason is kind of obvious. If it's a small republic, then the factions, the interest groups, are much better defined, and they are much better able to get control of the representative. In other words, in a small republic, certain groups of people call the shots for everybody else. And the fact that there's an elected representative doesn't present a problem, because the particular faction tends to control or dominate the will of the representatives. So what Madison is suggesting is the larger you can make the constituency, the better representatives you're going to get. He goes on and clarifies this even further and says, in the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried, and the suffrages of the people being more free will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. That paragraph, it seems to me, is critical. What Madison is saying here is that one of the advantages of a large republic over a small one is that since the representative is elected by more people, more voters, there's just larger number of voters in the large constituency rather than the small one. That very fact makes it difficult for certain interest groups, certain factions, to, as he says, practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried. It becomes more difficult for particular factions to call the shots within the constituency because there are so many factions within the group, within the enlarged republic. The result of this is, because there are so many different groups, it becomes more difficult for any one group to control the electors, the voters. It becomes more difficult for particular groups of people to tell people how to vote. Consequently, Madison says, by creating the large republic over the small one, it results in the suffrages of the people being more free. In other words, by having the large republic, you free up the voters to cast their ballots for the best people rather than being owned by certain groups, if that makes sense. It used to be, many of you will remember in our history, especially when the big cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we had these political machines in many of our cities, these political bosses and ward bosses and all of that, where these people would dictate elections. They would tell people how to vote. Here's our slate of candidates. You vote for these. And if they lose, you lose your job. So in a sense, even though people could vote, they weren't free to decide who to vote for. Madison says a large constituency is going to change that. It's going to make the voter free of group control and therefore free up the voter to look for the best people, the people with the enlarged public views, the people with the kinds of reputations that indicate that they're more likely to focus on the public interest rather than their own self-interest. So Madison says the large constituency or the large republic versus the small republic has a number of advantages. It has advantages in terms of the kinds of representatives that will be elected, and it also has advantages in that it frees up the voters to look for the best people. Then he goes on, and Madison says this. And again, I think that these phrases in parts of the document that are often not even focused on, not even looked at, Madison is reinforcing this interpretation. He's giving us hints that I believe reinforces the interpretation that we're making here about refining and enlarging the public views. Madison said it must be confessed that in this, as in most cases, there is a mean on both sides of which inconveniences will be found to lie. In other words, there's an ideal balance in terms of the number of representatives or the ideal size of the constituency. By enlarging too much the number of electors, you render the representatives too little acquainted with all their local circumstances and lesser interests. As by reducing it too much, you render him unduly attached to these and too little fit to comprehend and pursue the great and national objects. So if you have too few, if the republic is too small, then you run into the problem where the candidate, the elected representatives, is going to be beholden to certain groups and is not going to be able to represent his constituents in a way that comprehends and pursues the great and national objects. In other words, the public interest. If the representative is owned by private interests, then the representative is not going to be able to exercise his commitment to the public interest. And then Madison says, and he lays out the political circumstances at the time, he says the federal Constitution forms a happy combination in this respect. The great and aggregate interests being referred to the national, the local, and particular to the state legislatures. This is part of the reason why Madison wants to keep the states. A lot of people argued at the time of the convention that what the convention was doing in the Constitution is creating a consolidated government which would render the states would just drive the states out of existence. They would have so little power that there'd be no reason for them to even function, and the national government would make all the decisions. Madison is insistent that this isn't true. You got to keep the state governments. You got to keep the local governments, the municipal governments, the county governments, the city governments. I believe that Madison's defense of the importance of the states in this federal system is explained directly by this idea of refining and enlarging the public views by passing them through chosen bodies of citizens. I believe, in a sense, that this paragraph, which oftentimes is not even acknowledged to be in Federalist Number 10, is a key one. Because in it, Madison is explaining why what he is proposing earlier can work, how it will work. I want to share with you a couple of points. We're just moving towards the top of the hour. We've got about 3 minutes to go before we get to the top of the hour, so at least I can share one of these with you. I had said yesterday, and it's very important that we do this, it's all well and good to interpret Madison this way. But is there any validity? Is there are there other sources which validate this interpretation? Are we just imposing this on Madison's Federalist Number 10? Or are there others who understand and are saying essentially the same thing? Let me share with you David Hume. Well, first of all, let me tell you what it is we're going. We're looking to validate. By reading again Madison's Federalist Number 10, the paragraph in question. Madison talks about refining and enlarging the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it, the public interest, to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, Madison says, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose. I guess the question is this something that Madison divined? Is this something that just came to him one night in a dream? Or is there any source or any evidence that other people were thinking in the same way? Because if we find other people who are saying the same kinds of things, then it seems to me it makes this particular reading of Madison more likely to be on target, more likely to be true. David Hume, in his writing on the Perfect Republic, Hume says the following: in a large government, which is modeled with masterly skill, there is compass and room enough to refine the democracy. From the lower people, who may be admitted into the first elections or first concoction of the Commonwealth, to the higher magistrates who direct all the movements. At the same time, the parts are so distant and remote that it is very difficult, either by intrigue, prejudice, or passion, to hurry them into any measures against the public interest. David Hume is writing 50 years before Madison and is explaining how you can make popular government work. Madison reads this. He adopts it. Douglas Adair's writing and analysis and comparisons between David Hume and James Madison make very clear that Madison's Federalist Number 10 is born in the writing in the mind of David Hume. And you can see Madison coming through in this particular statement. In a large government which is modeled with masterly skill, there is compass and room enough to refine the democracy. From the lower people who may be admitted into the first elections or first concoction of the Commonwealth, to the higher magistrates who direct all the movements. So again, you can call it refinement, you can call it filtration, you can call it distillation, you can call it blanching self-interest out of the representatives, or you can call it a series of concoctions of the Commonwealth. Each level of election that you go up, as it becomes more important, you are in the process refining the public views. And when you do that, when you get to the top, where the big decisions are made, the parts are so distant and so remote, Hume says, that it's very difficult, either by intrigue, prejudice, or passion, to hurry them into measures against the public interest. In other words, by the time you get to the top, people's focus on the public interest is so strong that the pressure of interest groups, at least in theory, becomes less pronounced. It becomes less likely to affect what government does. In theory, and again, all of this is theory, in theory, when you get to the top of the ladder, so to speak, you are dealing with representatives whose priority is the public interest. And so strong is their commitment to the public interest and to representing their constituents in fulfilling and carrying out the public interest that they are more easily able to resist the pressures of factions and interest groups. Now, if those of you out there thinking about Congress and what's going on in Washington today, you are likely saying to yourself, it ain't working. Madison is a dreamer. We got just the opposite. Everything that Madison said could go wrong is wrong. And I think that's where we need to go when we complete this particular document. That's David Hume. There's no question that David Hume's thinking and analysis and insight clearly informs the thinking and the strategies of James Madison. The system that Madison comes up with for Federalist Number 10 seems to be taken pretty much from the writing and the thinking of David Hume. It's 4 minutes after the hour, the top of the hour. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, as we usually do in our programs, our 2-hour programs. Then we'll come back, and we have about 50, 52, or 53 minutes to go. And I think we can use that to complete Federalist Number 10 and at least tie up our programming for the week by having finished this document. Then we can go back and revisit it in a future program, next Monday, hopefully. And we can begin to speculate and look at what's happening within our government today and try to get some idea as to where the breakdown is and what might be wrong. And from that, of course, what we might do to help fix it. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to go into a 5-minute break at this 5 minutes after the hour, and then we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Thank you for the music. Thank you for the introduction. And welcome back to this, our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is our final hour in today's program. It's our final broadcast hour of the week. So the next time that we will be back with you will be the first day of next week, which will be next Monday, 1 p.m. in the East. And we will have our regular 2-hour, 120-minute program scheduled on that day. The only day that we do abbreviated programs are on Tuesdays. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome. We are just reaching the final portion of Madison's Federalist number 10. For those of you who have struggled and sweated through this, I thank you for staying with us. I hope I haven't driven you away, but I really believe there's so much within this document. It is just so rich and so very important. It's vital to our whole political system as it is indeed constructed. We invite you to share your thinking and your ideas, your concerns, your thoughts with us, not only with me, but with everybody else who is tuned in to the Virtual Center. We have a phone number. The number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me on some of these issues, waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. And remember, O'Brien is I-E-N, not I-A-N. I think that's important. Also, I remind you of our Facebook page. If you go to the Facebook on your search engine and just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will find our page, and there I have posted a number of issues, some of them rather short, some of them not so short, and I will continue to do that as we move along. I want to really make this page a compendium of some of the issues, some of the important issues that we have addressed here at the Virtual Center. I want people to be able to go to that page and to be able to read some of the thinking and some of the conversation that has gone into our thinking as we investigate the nature of the Constitution itself and the role of citizens within that process, within the Republic. So again, I think we're back to Federalist number 10, and you'll recall that right at the top of the hour, I had shared with you a paragraph written by David Hume, which seems to be the source for a lot of Madison's thinking on this. In fact, Gary Wills, in his book Explaining America, which is on the Federalist Papers, Gary Wills makes the statement that this particular paragraph, from David Hume, most likely excited Madison because it seemed to solve the problems of faction in Republican governments that had gone on throughout history. This seemed to be the key to a possible solution. And that's the paragraph that we looked at from David Hume. Let me share with you yet another source for thinking in this direction, namely Alexander Hamilton. Federalist number 68. In Federalist number 68, Hamilton is talking about the role envisioned by the Constitution for the president. He's talking about the office of president, the powers, the limitations on its powers, the dangers inherent in the office of chief magistrate or president, all of this. And Hamilton in number 68 makes specific reference to the same idea of refining and enlarging the public views as far as the president is concerned. Here's what Hamilton says in Federalist number 68. Talents for low intrigue and the little arts of popularity may alone suffice to elevate a man to the first honors in a single state. In other words, in one state, a person can rise to the top through his talents for low intrigue and his very popularity. But, Hamilton says, it will require other talents and a different kind of merit to establish him in the esteem and confidence of the whole Union, or of so considerable a portion of it as would be necessary to make him a successful candidate for the distinguished office of President of the United States. It will not be too strong to say that there will be a constant probability of seeing the station, the office of President, filled by characters preeminent for ability and virtue. Again, the mention of virtue, by definition, virtue is the ability to put aside self-interest in favor of the public interest. This is what we're talking about. This is the process that Madison describes to us in Federalist number 10. Hamilton says this very same process is going to help us identify the most competent people to be president of the entire Union, because by definition they will have to have the broad view and the ability to focus, to zero in like a laser beam on the public interest ahead of their own private interest. Now, if you're like me, you are probably thinking right now of the 24 candidates that are currently fighting it out for nomination of the two major parties in the presidential election of 2016. In fact, the number of candidates on the Republican side, the first debate a couple of weeks ago, as you will recall, 2 weeks ago tomorrow, the debate was limited to the polls top 10, if you will. So that meant that there were 7 or so other candidates who didn't make the cut. And if you look at Hamilton's definition here, or explanation, as to the kinds of people that would be fit to hold the office of president, and you begin to compare these criteria with the candidates who have identified themselves so far for the election of 2016, if you're like me, you probably see a little bit of a contradiction, a rather significant gap in some places. But again, I think Hamilton's description of the kind of worldview that the president would have to have in order to be successful tends to validate or reinforce the process of refining and enlarging the public views that Madison lays out in Federalist number 10. One additional source, it seems to me, James Wilson of Pennsylvania. If you read the debates, Madison's debates of the Constitutional Convention, and again, these are all printed online. All you need to do is go to Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, and you will find websites that will make Madison's notes to you day by day by day throughout the convention. So if you know that a particular issue came up on a particular day, you can target that particular source from Madison's notes. And again, Madison's notes on the convention are the most complete that exist. James Wilson, if you read the debates of the convention, James Wilson turned out to be one of Madison's most consistent supporters at the convention. Wilson was a Federalist from Philadelphia. And I might say, parenthetically, if you have seen the movie 1776, the musical, I have praised that numerous times in the past because the characters, the read on the individual characters who were there during the writing and voting on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. James Wilson surfaces in that film as a bit of a buffoon. The film suggests that James Wilson really didn't do any independent thinking on his own, but took his marching orders from John Dickinson throughout the process. I think you would find a consistency between James Wilson and John Dickinson, but how much of it is a personal obligation to do exactly what Dickinson tells him to do, I think is a little bit questionable. But there's no question that their philosophies are similar enough that they would take the same side on issues more often than not. But the fact of the matter is, in 1787, the Constitution of the United States, James Wilson becomes a major figure in supporting the Constitution and supporting the view of the Constitution, Madison's Virginia Plan, etc. Wilson talks about the same process of refining the public views. Wilson says the following: if the people at their elections take care to choose none but representatives that are wise and good, their representatives will take care in turn to choose or appoint none but such are wise and good also. The remark applies to every succeeding election and appointment. Thus, the characters proper for public offices will be diffused from the immediate elections of the people over the remotest parts of the administration. Wilson is laying out exactly how a series of elections, from the lowest elections to the highest elections, will help us identify the figures, the people most fit, most qualified to sit in these higher offices. Back to Federalist number 10. You'll recall that Madison started this last section by saying that a republic, a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, promises the cure for which we are seeking for factions. And then he said there are two major differences between a democracy and a republic. The first one was the delegation of the government in a republic to particular people whose wisdom and love of justice, and that's the process that we've been looking at. There's still one more point of difference between a democracy and a republic that Madison has yet to focus on, and that is the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which a republic may be extended. So if we move down toward the end of the document, we find that paragraph where Madison takes on the second advantage of a republic over a democracy. And this is the way he expresses it. The other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than of Democratic government. And it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than the latter, in Republican as opposed to Democratic government. Republican government can handle a much larger area or constituency than can democracy, because by definition, democracy is based on majority rule, and for real democracy to happen, you have to be able to bring the people together in order that the majority can identify itself, can exist. And that's exactly what Madison is trying to prevent from happening. And so the other advantage of the republic is the larger territory that is possible in a republic as opposed to a democracy. And then Madison goes through a process of analysis that is brilliant and is really not hard to follow. I encourage you to just listen to Madison's words and think along with him as he takes us through the process step by step by step. Madison says, the smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller number of individuals composing the majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. What does Madison mean by executing their plans of oppression? He means majority rule. He said, in a small society, a small republic, the fewer will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the parties and interests composing it, the more frequently will there be a majority. And the smaller the area, the fewer the individuals comprising the majority, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Madison is defining majority rule democracy as oppression. What's the solution? Madison says, extend the sphere. You take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common interest, a common motive, to invade the rights of other citizens. Or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. That's Madison's solution to the threat of majority rule democracy. Extend the sphere. You take in a greater variety of parties and interests. In other words, you guarantee that you will have so many different factions. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive. In other words, you make it less likely that there will even be a majority. Or if there is a majority, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. And then Madison goes on to conclude that paragraph with the following. Besides other impediments, it may be remarked, he says, that where there is a consciousness of unjust and dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. Whenever distrust of what the representative is doing happens, that's going to inhibit communication within the group, within the constituency. And so that's going to make it more difficult for the representative who is practicing intrigue and trying to organize an interest group to be successful, because communication will be less effective because people will distrust the motives of the representative. There's no question that the combination of the transfer of power from the voters to the representative and the enlarged sphere idea together are the two ingredients that make Madison's plan workable. If you extend the sphere, you take in so many people, so many competing factions, that you make it less likely that there is a majority, or even if there is one, you render it unable to organize. The size of the constituency, the size of the representative district, if you will, is so large and so complex that to organize a majority faction in a large area like this becomes impossible. Consequently, if the majority cannot organize, if the majority cannot come together and enforce its will on the representative, then the decision-making authority stays with the representative. The representative is the decision maker as long as the majority cannot organize. So what you have then, it seems to me, is an interesting scenario here. Because by definition, the large constituency is going to mean that the best known people in the larger constituency are the most prominent, the wealthiest, the most influential, the established families. By definition, when you enlarge the sphere, you eliminate the vast majority of people from the chance to be elected as the representative. Not only are you making the majority faction less likely to organize or impossible to organize and less likely to exist, you are also eliminating all but a very few candidates from the chance to win a vote, win an election in that large constituency. But again, that alone is not it. You've got to remember that in the process, you are educating your citizens to look for candidates with a wider, broader public view. And they are engaged in a process, a series of elections, which is gradually filtering out self-interest and strengthening the commitment of the representatives to the public interest. So that when they get elected at the national level, to Congress, for example, their goal is to get together with other people who have been through the same process. And what you have is a body of the best people from all the constituencies that make up the nation, sitting together with the public interest being their focus, self-interest being repressed. And Madison believes that's the way that you can ensure that the public interest will receive the proper attention and private interest will be pushed into the background and repressed. That's the plan. That's the strategy. It's brilliant. And I'm sure there are many people out there, including, I was going to name certain people, but there are many people out there, and myself included, who begin to recognize how abstract and how, well, it's not abstract. I mean, in theory it is, but then when you start to apply it, it theoretically becomes somewhat workable. The problem is that when we look at government today, we have trouble seeing it. Not only do we have trouble seeing it, we have trouble even knowing that it ought to be there. There are 2 paragraphs, actually 3 short paragraphs left in Madison's Federalist number 10. The first one pretty much brings together or reinforces or elaborates on how this system, this scheme, this strategy that Madison has explained or defined will work. Madison says, hence it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, is enjoyed by the Union over the states composing it. In light of the problems defined by Madison in the Confederation, under the Articles of Confederation, Madison believes that the transfer of power from the states to the national government will create the larger sphere, the larger constituents, the larger congressional districts, which will make it possible to bring this theory into fruition. Now Madison asks a series of questions, and they are a series of rhetorical questions because Madison presumes that the answers are obvious. Does the advantage, Madison says, does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudices and schemes of injustice? Does it? He said it will not be denied that the representation of the Union will be most likely to possess these requisite endowments. In other words, we've accomplished the first question, the first thing. Does the advantage, do we now have a system that will substitute representatives with enlightened views and virtuous sentiments over those driven by local prejudices and schemes of injustice, self-interest? Have we done that? And then he says there's absolutely no question that we have. And then he raises the next question. Does it consist in the greater security afforded by a greater variety of parties against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest? Have we accomplished the process of eliminating the dangers of a majority faction by creating so much factions, such a greater variety of parties, that it will be impossible for one to form the majority, and if they do, they will be rendered by their location, by the fact that the area that they represent is so wide that they won't be able to organize and carry out their schemes of oppression. Then he asks a third question. In an equal degree, does the increased variety of parties comprised within the Union increase this security? Does it, in fine, consist in the greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishment of the secret wishes of an unjust and interested majority? And again, Madison's system has rendered the majority faction, has rendered majority rule democracy impotent, unable to work. Here again, he says, the extent of the Union gives it the most palpable advantage. Then he goes on to the next issue. The influence of factious leaders. He says the influence of factious leaders, heads of factions, self-interested demagogues, may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. In other words, what Madison is saying is, even if a faction or an interest group is able to take over the entire government of a state, it won't be able to get a like control over all the states. Because when you create a national constituency, you make the majority so much bigger and so much more spread out. You render majority rule impossible. I think I need to pause here and make the obvious point. I've made it several times in the past, but I think it makes some sense now. And that is that I believe technology, more specifically, those aspects of technology which make up what we call today the communications revolution, have rendered much of Madison's thinking here outdated. Technology has made it possible to organize factions throughout a larger and larger constituency. We see this happening. We see entire governments being toppled with mass demonstrations orchestrated with cell phones. We see organized groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council able to organize and identify agents in a number of states to go back to their states, having gotten their marching orders from Central, and proposing model legislation to try to run through their individual state legislatures. And what you find is that these model pieces of legislation are exactly the same, because they are drafted in the same place by the same people, and they are merely handed out to agents who take them back to the different states. For example, it is not an accident that the very same legislation passed in West Virginia to undo the Common Core, or to reject the Common Core standards, is the same legislation that has been adopted in other states that have rejected the Common Core standards. Not because representatives of the states have come together to draft the draft legislation, but because a central organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has drafted it, has hired the people and the expertise to draft it, and then has given it to minions, more than 2,000 of them, that are scattered throughout the Union in various state legislatures. So consequently, what you find is that laws proposing rejection of Common Core, laws opposing increases in minimum wage, laws designed to end prevailing wage legislation, and on and on and on, are coming from a central source. And the ability to organize and communicate across county lines, across state lines, from one coast to the other coast, is making it possible to create factions, larger factions, than Madison ever dreamed about. So I think that's extremely significant. I think that's the strategy being employed by groups like the Koch brothers and others that are investing tens of millions of dollars in our election campaigns and literally buying influence in our state legislatures. It is so inconsistent and contrary to the functioning of a republic in the mind and in the eyes of the man who designed our republic that it is frightening. But until you know what Madison intended, until we know how the republic was designed to operate, we can't really understand the dangers that we see emerging around us. All we can do is know that they're bad, but it becomes very difficult for us to articulate the reasons that they are bad. That's the value, it seems to me, of this kind of information. It gives us a foundation from which to operate. It gives us a basis on which to compare and contrast, to look at what's happening and evaluate it in the context of what Madison intended. Madison's example toward the end of the Federalist number 10 about factious leaders may be able to kindle a flame within a state, but they'll be unable to spread this flame throughout the other states. Madison uses the example of religious freedom to make his point. He said, a religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy. But the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of the Confederacy must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. In other words, Madison believes that religious freedom, the ability of religious groups to organize and function under our Constitution protected by the First Amendment, results in the fact that there are so many different religious groups existing and functioning within our republic that no one of them can take over. In other words, the fact that there are so many of them protects the freedom of every one of them. Madison believes that that same principle applies here to the nature of civil rights. If religious rights can be protected by the variety of sects, different religious sects, spread over the entire face of the Confederacy, so also we have the same thing in civil rights. And then Madison points out a few examples of some of the things that were successful in the Confederation that will no longer be successful under the Constitution. And the issues that he chooses as examples are significant because they are economic issues driven by the difference between majority factions and minority factions based on property. This is what Madison says. A rage for paper money, for the abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, socialism, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. In the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. So just as the number of religious groups makes it impossible for one group to take over and threaten the freedom of the others, so also the spread out, extended nature of the Union makes it impossible for things like paper money, dividing up property and redistributing it on the basis of equality to everybody, abolishing debts. I think it's very appropriate and very significant that Madison uses those examples as evidence as to how good the Constitution is going to make it for the Republic. And then finally, at the very end, the last two sentences of the document say the following. In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. And according to the degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and supporting the character of Federalists. In other words, what Madison is saying at the very end of the document is, now that we've been through it, now that we know how it's designed to function, I hope you will get on board and make sure that this happens. In other words, get this Constitution ratified. Because we have explained how it's going to resolve most of the major problems created by the Confederation. And that is Madison's Federalist number 10. I think it's an incredible document. I think it is so rich and so informative that it goes so far to provide us insight and information on how this political system was set up and designed to work. Once we understand that, once we can appreciate that, then it seems to me we can pinpoint the threats and the dangers of those who would advocate things and do things that would jeopardize the Republic. I think that many of us can see some of the problems that are being laid out before us in Washington, D.C. The fact that Congress can't pass anything. The fact that polarization between the two parties and between conservatives and liberals within each party has become so hard and fast that the ability and the willingness to step across the aisle and work with your opponents becomes less and less possible. In fact, we have reached the point where people who try to work across the aisle and work in tandem with their opponents are criticized as being weak and spineless, people without principle, people who don't stand for anything. The fact of the matter is, the people who are willing to do this are the people who are most accurately reflecting the definition of representative government defined by James Madison, the person who created the system at the outset. I think it's very important that we appreciate that. I think this is probably where we'll begin our program on Monday. I want to refer you back to the conversation that we had some weeks ago around the paper delivered on polarization in Congress by Larry Kramer. You remember that Larry Kramer was the dean of the law school at Stanford University. And within the last year or so, he resigned his position at Stanford to take over this position as head of the Hewlett Foundation, a foundation with resources between $8 and $9 billion. And a major initiative of the Hewlett Foundation is to resolve some of the dysfunction in our republic that Larry Kramer, who's an accomplished expert on our Republican government, has seen in the system created by Madison. Kramer, you'll remember, argued that the goal of our republic is to promote and encourage deliberation, negotiation, and compromise, not to emphasize the issues which divide us, but to issue or emphasize the issues which unite us, to bring people together and create the process of discord and conversation and dialogue that can produce results in a functioning republic. That, Larry Kramer reminds us, was Madison's plan. That's what Madison had in mind. That's what Federalist 10 was about. That's what Federalist number 51 is about. And it seems to me Larry Kramer is right on target with his concerns that our republic seems to have become dysfunctional. Polarization, demagoguery, and I don't need to identify the people associated with this. You know the people. The people who advocate the shutdown of government and the blackmailing of one interest group by another, and all these other things, and the efforts to defame character, and the money that's going into our campaign system in order to buy votes and buy legislatures and buy control of government, by the plutocracy that has become so powerful and so wealthy at the expense of everybody else that now they have reached a point where they are literally trying to buy the government itself and use government to implement or to enact their self-interest and try to claim that it is the public interest. We know what the public interest is. Madison told us what the public interest is. Madison told us how to find it, how to define it, how to promote it, how to strengthen it, how to enact it, how to celebrate it. And instead we have people who are trying to use their vast fortune to convince us that their private interest is the public interest. We can't allow ourselves to fall for it. We can't do it. There's too much at stake. There's too much on the line. Literally, the survival of the republic is at stake. And I think now, I hope, that as a result of our programs over the last 3 weeks here at the Virtual Center, I hope that this reading and analysis of Federalist number 10 has given us the substance, the documentation, the evidence, the insight to understand what it is we need to do, where the problems are, and how best to confront them. On that note, I can't think of a better way to end our programming here this week at the Virtual Center. We have a little bit more than a minute to go. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you for your support. I want to thank you for your patience. I acknowledge that I fall victim sometimes to a little bit more passion on this stuff. I find this stuff so exciting and so important. And to think that I've been blessed with the opportunity, thanks to Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On, to present this analysis and do what I can do. It makes me feel like I'm doing something in the best interests of the Republic. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity. And I'm so grateful for your willingness to support the effort. Thank you. I hope that you have a wonderful week, a wonderful evening, a wonderful week, and that you'll join us next week for the start of another week of programs here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Thank you so very, very much. Good day.